It began the night the words stopped making sense, when Daniel's daughter asked him what hallowed meant, and he realized he had been speaking the Lord's Prayer for 43 years without understanding half of what he was saying, when the syllables that had been comfort became questions, when the ritual that had held his family together revealed itself as a doorway he had never fully walked through. Daniel was a farmer in Nebraska, third generation to work the same 300 acres of corn and soybeans that his grandfather had purchased in 1952, a man whose hands knew soil better than they knew tenderness, whose faith was as much habit as conviction, whose life had been measured in seasons and harvests, and the slow accumulation of equity that would pass to his children when his body finally gave out from the decades of labor that farming demanded. He had married young, 22 years old, when he stood beside Claire in the small Methodist church, where both their families had been members since before either of them was born, and together they had built a life that looked from the outside like the American dream. 3 children raised with discipline and love, a mortgage paid off 10 years early, community respect earned through reliability and hard work, and never asking for more than what was owed. But something had been missing, something Daniel couldn't name, an emptiness that had grown larger as the years passed, a sense that he was going through motions without meaning, that the prayers he spoke and the hymns he sang and the values he tried to instill in his children were all pointing towards something he had never actually touched, had never directly experienced, had only inherited like the land itself, valuable but not personally earned, true but not personally verified. His eldest son Jacob had left for college and never come back except for holidays, had gotten a degree in environmental science, and now worked for a firm in Denver doing something with renewable energy that Daniel pretended to understand, but really didn't. And the distance between them wasn't just geographical but philosophical, a gulf that had opened when Jacob started questioning the farming practices that had sustained their family for 3 generations, started talking about soil depletion and chemical runoff and sustainability in ways that made Daniel feel defensive, made him feel like his entire life's work was being judged and found wanting by a son who had never had to worry about whether there would be food on the table or money for school clothes or whether the bank would call in the operating loan. His daughter Sarah was 17 and angry in the way teenagers are angry, pushing against every boundary, questioning every rule, accusing Daniel and Claire of being hypocrites because they went to church on Sunday, but watched Fox News the rest of the week, because they talked about loving their neighbor but complained about immigrants, because they said they trusted God but worried constantly about money, and Daniel didn't have good answers to her challenges, could only fall back on because I said so and as long as you live under my roof, responses that he knew were inadequate, but that were all he had, all his father had given him, all the generations before had passed down as if authority alone could substitute for wisdom. His youngest, Matthew, was 12 and still believed, still said his prayers without irony, still looked at Daniel like he had answers, and Daniel felt the weight of that trust, like stones in his pockets, felt the responsibility of shaping a soul, felt terrified that he was passing on the same half-understood faith, the same ritual without revelation, the same forms without substance that he had received. If you've ever felt that same emptiness, that same sense of going through spiritual motions without real connection, drop a comment below and let us know you're not alone in this journey, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next, because what this family experienced changed everything. They thought they knew about prayer, about faith, about what's really waiting just beyond the veil of ordinary reality. It was Claire's idea to start saying the Lord's Prayer together every evening after dinner, an attempt to create family unity, to give them something to share besides complaints and schedules and the grinding routine of work and school and chores that filled their days with activity but not connection. And Daniel had agreed mainly because he didn't know what else to try, didn't know how to bridge the distances that had grown between them, didn't know how to be the father and husband he wanted, to be when he was so exhausted from farming and from trying to make ends meet in an economy that seemed designed to squeeze family farms out of existence, to replace them with corporate operations that could absorb losses and exploit loopholes and operate at scales that turned agriculture into industry rather than way of life. So they gathered each evening at 7 o'clock in the living room, the 5 of them sitting in a circle on couches and chairs that had been purchased 15 years ago and were showing their age, and they held hands, and Daniel would lead them through the prayer that Jesus had taught his disciples 2,000 years ago, "Our Father who art in heaven, Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom. Come, thy will be done on earth, as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. The first week was awkward. Sarah rolling her eyes, Jacob checking his phone whenever he thought his parents weren't looking, Matthew the only one who seemed genuinely engaged. But Claire insisted they continue, and gradually it became routine, became something they did without thinking about it, became background noise in the soundtrack of their lives. Then on the 14th night, when they were halfway through the prayer, when Daniel was saying, "Give us this day our daily bread," something changed. The air in the room shifted, the temperature dropped, the lights flickered once, twice, 3 times, and they all felt it, all stopped mid-word and looked at each other with expressions that mixed confusion and fear and something else, something that might have been recognition, might have been the sense that something they had been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting, had finally arrived. Daniel tried to continue the prayer, but his voice caught. The words stuck in his throat like they had weight, like they required more energy to speak than he possessed, and he looked around the circle and saw that the others felt it too. Saw Claire's eyes wide and Matthew gripping her hand so tight his knuckles were white, and Sarah sitting forward on the edge of the couch alert in a way she never was during family prayer, and Jacob staring at a point in the center of their circle where the air seemed thicker somehow, seemed to be moving in ways that air shouldn't move, seemed to be gathering into something that had presence without having form. The room grew colder still, their breath visible in the air despite it being August, despite the temperature outside being 90 degrees and humid, and Daniel wanted to stand, wanted to break the circle, wanted to turn on all the lights and check the doors and take control of the situation, the way he took control of everything on the farm, but he couldn't move. None of them could move. They were held in their places not by force, but by something else, by curiosity maybe, by awe, by the sense that if they moved, they would break something fragile, would miss something important, would lose an opportunity that wouldn't come again. The presence in the center of the circle began to coalesce, began to take shape, light gathering like fog but brighter, warmer, humming with a frequency that Daniel felt in his chest and his bones and the base of his skull, and he understood without words that they were not alone, that something had heard their prayer, had responded to their prayer, had used the prayer as a kind of doorway or invitation or bridge between their reality and somewhere else, somewhere that had always been there, but that they had been too distracted or too defended or too committed to materialism to perceive. The light formed into something almost human-shaped, but taller and more graceful, and without the hard edges that physical bodies have, and where a face should have been, there was only more light, but Daniel could feel attention coming from it, could feel that he was being seen with a thoroughness that should have been violating, but instead felt like relief, like someone finally understanding him completely, like being known for the first time in his life, not as the roles he played, not as farmer or husband or father, but as the consciousness that wore those roles like clothes, as the awareness that had been present in his life since before he could remember, that had watched him grow from child to man, that had witnessed every choice and every failure and every moment of grace, that knew him better than he knew himself, because it was him, the deepest part of him, the part he had been running from his entire life, because to acknowledge it would require changing everything, would require admitting that the life he had built was too small, was a prison he had mistaken for security, was safety purchased at the price of aliveness. The being spoke but not with sound, communicated but not with words, and Daniel understood in a way that bypassed language that this was what people had been calling angels, what his ancestors had interpreted through the lens of Christian theology, but what was actually something older and larger and stranger than any single tradition could contain, beings that existed in dimensions adjacent to the physical, that were made of consciousness itself or light itself or whatever substance dreams and thoughts and awareness were made of, beings that had been interacting with humanity since before recorded history, appearing in forms that matched the expectations and beliefs of whoever encountered them, called angels by Christians and devas by Hindus and jinn by Muslims and star people by indigenous tribes, all of them describing the same phenomenon through different cultural lenses, all of them touching the same elephant from different angles and reporting what they felt with the vocabulary available to them. The being showed Daniel things, filled his mind with images that unfolded like flowers opening in time-lapse, showed him that prayer was not petition to an external God, but alignment with the consciousness that pervaded all things, showed him that the Lord's Prayer was a kind of technology, a sequence of concepts and intentions, that when spoken with presence and sincerity created a resonance that attracted attention from beings that existed at higher frequencies, showed him that Jesus had been one of these beings, had incarnated in human form to teach humanity how to access its own divine nature, had given the prayer as a tool, not as a ritual, as a map, not as a script, as a living practice that could transform consciousness when approached with openness and surrender rather than rote repetition. Daniel saw that every line of the prayer contained layers of meaning he had never considered, that Our Father who art in heaven was not about a distant deity on a throne, but about recognizing that consciousness itself was the parent source from which all individual awareness emerged, that hallowed be thy name was not about worship, but about recognizing the sacred in all things, in every moment, in every person, in the very fabric of existence itself, that thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, was not about waiting for some future event, but about bringing the frequency of higher dimensions into physical reality through how you lived, how you treated others, how you saw the world. That give us this day, our daily bread, was not about food but about trust, about releasing the anxiety and control that came from believing you had to secure your own survival, rather than trusting the intelligence of the universe to provide what was needed. That forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, was not about moral bookkeeping, but about releasing the energy that got locked up in resentment and judgment, about freeing yourself from the past so you could be fully present, about recognizing that everyone was doing the best they could with the consciousness they had access to, and that condemnation served no one, that lead us not into temptation but deliver us from evil, was not about avoiding pleasure or fighting against darkness, but about choosing in every moment whether to identify with the small fearful self or the larger aware self that was connected to everything, that for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever, amen, was not about God's power over you, but about your participation in divine power, about recognizing that the kingdom was within you, had always been within you, that the glory was your own true nature shining through when you stopped covering it with fear and shame and the desperate need to prove your worth through achievement. Daniel wept as the information poured through him. Wept because he realized he had been saying these words his entire life without understanding them. Wept because he saw how much time he had wasted living from fear rather than from trust. Wept because he understood that the emptiness he had felt for decades was not a sign of his failure, but was actually his soul's way of telling him there was more available, that he had been settling for forms when substance was possible, that he had been standing outside a door thinking the door was the destination when all he had to do was walk through. The others were experiencing something similar. Daniel could feel it through their joined hands, could sense the transmission flowing through all of them simultaneously, each receiving what they specifically needed, each having their particular questions answered, each being shown the next step in their evolution, and he understood that this moment would divide their family's history into before and after, that they would never be able to pretend ignorance again, that they had been touched by something that would either transform them or drive them apart, because there was no middle ground, no way to partially accept what had been revealed. You either said yes to the fullness of it, or you spent the rest of your life trying to forget it, trying to squeeze back into the small story you had been living. And Daniel knew which choice he was making even as he felt the terror of it, felt the ground dissolving beneath his feet, felt everything familiar falling away. The presence began to withdraw, the light starting to dissipate, but before it faded completely, it left them with something, planted something in their consciousness that Daniel would later understand was a gift, was a frequency or vibration or seed that would continue growing, that would change how they perceived reality, that would make it impossible to see the world the way they had seen it before, that would open doors in their awareness that once opened could never be fully closed. When the light was gone, and they were sitting in the ordinary living room again with the ordinary lamps casting ordinary shadows, they stayed in the circle holding hands for a long time, none of them wanting to speak, none of them wanting to break the spell, all of them knowing that something profound had occurred, but not yet having language for it, not yet able to process what it meant. Finally Matthew spoke, his voice small and awed, asked if what just happened was an angel, asked if God had visited them, And Daniel found himself answering with more honesty than he had ever brought to questions about faith, found himself saying he didn't know what it was, didn't know if angel was the right word, didn't know if God worked the way they had been taught God worked, but he knew it was real, knew they had been given a gift, knew their prayers had been heard and answered in a way that was more direct and undeniable than he had ever imagined possible. Sarah was crying, not the angry, frustrated tears she usually cried, but something deeper, something that looked like relief. And she said she had been so angry because nothing made sense, because church felt empty and prayer felt fake, and everyone seemed to be pretending to believe things they didn't really believe. But what just happened was real, was the most real thing she had ever experienced. And maybe faith wasn't about believing impossible things, but about being open to experiences that transcended normal categories, about saying yes to mystery rather than demanding certainty. Jacob was staring at his hands like he didn't recognize them, and when he finally spoke, he said, "This changed everything," said he had spent years thinking spirituality and religion were just psychological coping mechanisms, just stories people told themselves to manage anxiety about death and meaninglessness, but what they just experienced couldn't be reduced to psychology, couldn't be explained by neuroscience or evolutionary biology, was evidence that consciousness was not produced by brains, but was the ground of being itself, and brains were just receivers that tuned into consciousness, the way radios tuned into signals that existed whether the radio was turned on or not. Claire was the last to speak, and she said she had been going through the motions for years, had been maintaining the appearance of faith while feeling nothing inside, had been terrified that she was a fraud, that everyone would discover she didn't really believe, that God, if God existed, would be angry at her for pretending. But what just happened showed her that God, or whatever that presence was, didn't care about belief, cared about openness, cared about sincerity, cared about the willingness to be present and vulnerable and honest, and she felt like she could finally breathe, like a weight she had been carrying for decades had just dissolved. They talked late into the night, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to integrate the experience with their ordinary understanding of reality, and Daniel found himself saying things he didn't know he knew, found words coming through him that had authority and wisdom he didn't possess on his own, found himself understanding that the being had left something behind, had adjusted something in his consciousness that allowed him to access knowledge that had always been there, but that he hadn't been able to reach, like a radio station that had always been broadcasting, but that he hadn't known how to tune into. The next morning, Daniel went out to work the fields as usual, but everything looked different. The cornstalks seemed to glow with an inner light. The soil seemed alive in a way he had never noticed. The insects and birds that he had mostly ignored suddenly seemed like expressions of the same consciousness he was, and he understood what indigenous people meant when they talked about everything being connected, about the web of life, about the necessity of honoring all beings, because all beings were family, were different expressions of the same source awareness playing different roles in the same divine drama. He found himself talking to the plants as he worked, not in words but in feeling, in appreciation, in gratitude for the way they transformed sunlight and soil and water into food, and he swore they responded, swore he could feel them leaning into his attention, growing more vigorously in the sections of field where he worked with this new awareness, compared to sections where his hired hands worked with the old consciousness of plants, as objects to be managed and exploited. Over the following weeks, the family continued to pray together every evening, and sometimes the presence returned, sometimes the light appeared, and each time they understood more, received more teaching, were shown more about the nature of reality and consciousness and the transformation that was coming, not just for their family, but for all of humanity, a collective awakening that was accelerating, that was approaching critical mass, that would soon become undeniable even to those who were most committed to materialism and separation, and the old paradigm that had dominated human civilization for thousands of years. Daniel learned that he was not alone, that other families and individuals around the world were having similar experiences, that prayer and meditation and sincere spiritual practice of any kind could create the conditions for contact, that the beings were always available, but most humans were too defended or distracted or identified with their thinking minds to perceive them, that what looked like an external visitation was actually an internal awakening, a remembering of capacities that had been dormant, that were built into human consciousness, but that required intention and practice to activate. He learned that the beings had been preparing humanity for this moment for millennia, had been appearing to prophets and mystics and ordinary people throughout history, had been gradually seeding ideas and awakening individuals who would serve as bridges when the collective transformation began, had been coordinating a planetary shift in consciousness that was timed to coincide with various factors, including technological development and ecological crisis, and the evolution of human nervous systems, all of it part of a vast plan that included and transcended individual human understanding. He learned that Jesus had been accurately described as the Son of God, but that every human was also a son or daughter of God, that Jesus had been demonstrating what was possible when consciousness fully awakened to its divine nature, that his message had been distorted by centuries of institutional religion that made him special and separate and unique, when his actual teaching was that he was showing the way, was modeling what humans could become, was inviting everyone to follow not by worshipping him but by doing what he did, accessing the same source, performing the same miracles, living from the same awareness that there was no separation between human and divine, between creation and creator, between the wave and the ocean. He learned that the second coming was not about Jesus returning as an external savior, but about Christ consciousness, awakening in every human heart, that the rapture was not about bodies ascending into clouds, but about consciousness ascending to higher frequencies, that the end times were not about destruction but about completion, the ending of one age and the beginning of another, the closing of a chapter in human evolution that had been characterized by separation and suffering, and the opening of a new chapter, characterized by unity and joy and the full flowering of human potential. Daniel started sharing what he was learning with others, carefully at first, testing the waters, not wanting to be dismissed as crazy or delusional, but he found that people were more receptive than he expected, found that many others had been having similar experiences, or were hungry for what he was offering, were tired of empty rituals and second-hand faith, and were ready for direct experience, for genuine transformation, for spirituality that was lived rather than just believed. Some in his community were threatened by what he was saying, accused him of heresy or New Age deception or demonic influence, and Daniel listened to their concerns with compassion, but without backing down, without apologizing for what he had experienced, without diluting the message to make it more palatable. And he found that his certainty came not from belief, but from direct knowing, from having touched something that was more real than consensus reality, from having been changed at a level that couldn't be reversed or denied or explained away. His relationship with his children transformed. The distance that had grown between them dissolved as they shared the common ground of seeking, of questioning, of being willing to not know, and Jacob came home more often, started conversations about consciousness and evolution, and the emerging paradigm that integrated science and spirituality rather than treating them as opposites. And Sarah softened, became less angry and more curious, started meditating, started keeping a journal of her own experiences and insights, started becoming the kind of young woman who would change the world, not through rebellion, but through embodying a new way of being. Matthew continued to be the most naturally open, the least defended, and Daniel watched his youngest son develop capacities that looked like what previous generations would have called gifts of the spirit, seeing auras, sensing emotions, knowing things before they happened. And instead of shutting these abilities down or dismissing them as imagination, Daniel encouraged them, helped Matthew understand what he was experiencing, connected him with others who had similar gifts, understood that the children being born now were wired differently, were arriving with capabilities that previous generations had to work years to develop, were the first wave of a new kind of human that would populate the earth after the transformation was complete. Claire blossomed in ways Daniel had never seen, had never known were possible. She had been so quiet for so long, so focused on supporting everyone else, on maintaining the household, on being the glue that held them together. But now she found her own voice, started leading a group for women in the community who wanted to explore spiritual practice beyond traditional church, started channeling wisdom that came through her in poetry and song, started painting images of the beings and the dimensions they showed her. And Daniel would find her some mornings standing in the field at dawn with her arms raised and her face tilted toward the sky and light streaming through her in visible waves, and he would stand at a distance and weep at the beauty of it, at the gift of witnessing his wife become fully herself, become the magnificent being she had always been, but had been too constrained by expectation and duty to express. The farm itself changed, or maybe Daniel's perception of it changed, maybe both. The yields increased despite him using fewer chemicals and less intensive methods. The soil became richer and darker and more alive. Earthworms returned in abundance where they had been scarce. Birds nested in numbers he hadn't seen since he was a child, and neighboring farmers started asking what he was doing differently, started commenting on how his fields looked healthier, how his crops seemed to withstand stress better, and Daniel would try to explain about consciousness, about treating the land as partner rather than resource, about prayers and gratitude and the beings who were helping him understand how to farm in alignment with natural intelligence rather than against it. And some farmers would nod politely and change the subject, while others would lean in, would ask more questions, would admit they had been feeling similar things, had been sensing that there was another way, had been waiting for someone to say it out loud so they wouldn't feel crazy. 5 months after the first visitation, the family was saying evening prayers again when the presence returned, with greater intensity than ever before, the room filling with light so bright they had to close their eyes, and the being communicated something Daniel had been sensing but hadn't wanted to face, communicated that the time of preparation was ending, that the public phase was beginning, that soon the beings would reveal themselves, not just to individuals and families, but to the entire world, that ships would appear in the skies in numbers that couldn't be denied or explained away, that humanity would have to confront the reality that they were not alone, had never been alone, that consciousness was the fundamental nature of reality, and that matter was just one expression of consciousness temporarily condensed into form, and that this revelation would either catalyze the greatest transformation in human history or would create chaos and conflict as those invested in the old paradigm fought to maintain control even as the ground shifted beneath their feet. The being showed them that their role was to hold steady, to be anchors of calm and clarity, to help others understand that what was happening was not invasion, but homecoming, not the end, but the beginning, not something to fear, but something to celebrate, and that they had been prepared specifically for this purpose, had been given experiences and insights and transmission that would allow them to serve as bridges for others who would be terrified and confused and desperate for guidance when the full disclosure occurred. Daniel accepted this with a mixture of excitement and dread, understanding that his ordinary life was over, that he was being drafted into service for something that transcended his personal preferences and plans, and yet he felt ready, felt like everything in his life had been preparation for this moment, felt like the decades of farming had taught him patience and trust, and the necessity of working with natural cycles rather than against them, felt like the years of struggle and doubt and emptiness had cracked him open enough that light could pour through, felt like the love he had for his family was expanding to include all families, all beings, all of creation, felt like he was becoming what he had been praying to for his entire life, felt like the distance between human and divine was dissolving, felt like he was remembering something he had always known but had forgotten, felt like he was coming home to himself, to truth, to the source that had sent him into physical form for this specific mission at this specific time on this specific planet that was going through the labor pains of birthing a new kind of civilization, a new way of being human that honored both the earthly and the cosmic, both the individual and the collective, both the form and the formless. And he knew that despite the challenges ahead, despite the chaos that would come, despite the resistance and the fear and the violence that some would choose in response to having their worldview shattered, ultimately love would win, consciousness would expand, humanity would awaken, and the kingdom that Jesus had spoken of, the kingdom that was within and among, would finally manifest on earth as it was in heaven, would finally become visible and tangible and undeniable, would finally fulfill the promise that every prophet and mystic had been pointing toward, that every prayer had been reaching for, that every heart secretly longed for, beneath the layers of protection and pretense and fear, the promise that separation was illusion, that love was the only reality, that home was not a place to get to, but a recognition that you had never left, that heaven was here and now and always had been, waiting patiently for consciousness to shift just enough that it could finally be perceived, finally be lived, finally be celebrated as the truth it had always been. The disclosure came on a Tuesday morning in March, when Daniel was in the fields checking irrigation lines, came not with warning but with totality, ships appearing simultaneously over every major city on Earth, massive and luminous and impossible to ignore, hovering at altitudes that made them visible for hundreds of miles, and Daniel felt it before he saw it, felt the shift in consciousness like a frequency change, felt the beings amplifying their presence to a level that made his heart race. And his hands tremble, and he stopped what he was doing and simply stood in the middle of his cornfield, looking up at a sky that was no longer empty, that was filled with evidence of what his family had been preparing for, what the evening prayers had been building toward, what the beings had promised was coming soon. He called Claire and the children came running from the house, and they stood together watching the ship that hovered over Lincoln, close enough that they could see it pulsing with patterns of light that might have been language or art or both, that communicated something directly to the nervous system, bypassing the need for translation. And Matthew was laughing with joy, and Sarah was crying, and Jacob was recording it on his phone, even though he knew the footage wouldn't capture what they were actually experiencing. And Claire took Daniel's hand and squeezed it and said, "This is it. This is what we've been preparing for." And Daniel nodded, knowing that their quiet life was over, that they were about to step into the role the beings had been training them for, that their purpose was about to become undeniably clear. Within hours, the media was in chaos. Every channel broadcasting the ships, experts offering theories that ranged from mass hallucination to military technology to exactly what it was, which was contact with non-human intelligence. And Daniel watched the confusion and fear spreading through the population and understood why the beings had spent months preparing individuals and families, why they had needed people who could hold steady while others panicked, why prayer and spiritual practice had been the doorway, because those who had been seeking connection with something larger than themselves were the ones most ready to accept that the universe was vastly more populated and conscious than materialist science had acknowledged. The phone started ringing, neighbors calling asking if Daniel had seen it, asking what he thought it meant, asking if it was the end times, asking if they should be afraid, and Daniel found himself offering reassurance he didn't know he possessed, found words flowing through him that calmed people, that helped them see this as opportunity rather than threat, that reminded them of the teachings they had received through faith traditions, that everything was held in love, that consciousness was primary and benevolent, that what looked like invasion was actually reunion with a cosmic family. Humanity had been isolated from only by its own limited perception. Father Thompson from the Methodist Church called asking Daniel to come speak to the congregation that was gathering spontaneously, people seeking community and guidance and some framework for understanding what was happening, and Daniel drove into town, past cars stopped on the side of the road, with people standing outside staring at the sky, past businesses that had closed early because employees couldn't focus on work when reality itself was being redefined, past the school where children were being dismissed early because parents were panicking, and when he arrived at the church he found it packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the lawn, and Father Thompson introduced him simply as a man who had been given insight into what was happening, who had been in contact with the beings, who could help them understand. Daniel stood at the pulpit looking at faces that reflected every emotion from terror to wonder, faces that belonged to people he had known his entire life, farmers and shop owners and teachers, and the woman who ran the post office, all of them stripped of their usual masks, all of them raw and vulnerable and desperate for meaning, and he spoke from the heart, told them about the evening prayers, about the being that had appeared in his living room, about the teachings he and his family had received, about how the Lord's Prayer was technology for aligning consciousness with higher frequencies, about how every religion contained pieces of truth but none contained all of it, about how the beings were not demons or invaders, but elder siblings in a cosmic family, about how Jesus had been one of them teaching humanity what was possible when consciousness fully awakened, about how the second coming they had been waiting for was happening right now as Christ consciousness flowered in, every heart that was open enough to receive it, about how the rapture was not bodies ascending, but awareness expanding to include dimensions that had always been there, about how judgment was simply truth revealing itself and each person seeing clearly what they had chosen and who they had become, and being offered another chance to choose love over fear. Some people in the congregation nodded with recognition. Some wept. Some stood up and walked out unable or unwilling to accept what he was saying, and Daniel let them go without judgment, understanding that everyone was on their own timeline, that forcing awakening never worked. that all he could do was offer what had been given to him and trust that those ready to hear would hear. After he finished speaking, people surrounded him with questions, with stories of their own experiences, with gratitude for giving voice to things they had been feeling but couldn't articulate, and Daniel spent hours listening and responding and connecting people with each other, helping them form the networks of support they would need in the days ahead as the transformation accelerated and the old world dissolved. The beings made formal contact on the seventh day, broadcast simultaneously to every television and radio and internet-connected device on the planet, their message translated into every language, their presence impossible to deny or dismiss, and they explained that they had been guiding humanity for millennia, that they had appeared to prophets and mystics throughout history, that they had been waiting for humanity to evolve to the point where open contact was possible without causing complete civilizational collapse, that they came in peace and service and celebration of humanity's graduation into the larger galactic community, that they offered technology and wisdom to help solve the crises of climate and inequality and violence that threatened to destroy human civilization, but that the real gift they offered was remembrance, was humanity recalling its own divine nature, was the recognition that consciousness was not produced by brains, but was the ground of being itself and humans, were expressions of that infinite consciousness temporarily localized in physical form for the purpose of learning and growing and contributing to the evolution of the whole. Daniel's farm became a gathering place. People came from across the region seeking guidance and community and confirmation that what they were experiencing was real, that they weren't alone in their confusion or their wonder. And Daniel and Claire and their children opened their home and their land, organized circles and prayer groups and practical workshops on how to maintain stability while reality shifted, on how to support friends and family members who were having difficulty integrating, the new paradigm on how to live from trust rather than fear, from openness rather than defensiveness, from love rather than separation. The government tried to maintain control at first, issued warnings about the beings, suggested they might be dangerous despite all evidence to the contrary, but the attempts at manipulation became increasingly transparent, and people stopped listening to authorities who had been lying to them for decades about the reality of contact, and new forms of organization emerged, decentralized networks based on trust and direct experience rather than on hierarchy and inherited power, and Daniel watched. With amazement as the social structures he had taken for granted, his entire life began to dissolve and reform into something more fluid and more aligned with natural principles of cooperation and mutual aid. Not everyone adapted gracefully. There were those who clung to the old paradigm with increasing desperation, who interpreted the beings through lenses of fear and saw invasion where there was only invitation, and violence erupted in some places, fundamentalist groups attacking anyone who welcomed the contact, governments using the chaos as excuse to impose martial law, but the awakened ones held steady, continued their work of being present and calm and available, and gradually the resistance exhausted itself, because you cannot fight evolution, cannot stop consciousness from expanding once critical mass has been reached, cannot keep people in prison once they remember they have wings. Daniel's relationship with Jacob deepened as his son's scientific training became valuable for helping others understand the physics of consciousness and multidimensional reality, translating the spiritual teachings into language that rational minds could accept, building bridges between science and mysticism that had been artificially separated for centuries, and Jacob started writing and speaking and creating content that went viral, that reached millions of young people who needed someone, their own age, speaking their language, telling them this was real, and it was okay to trust their direct experience rather than authority figures who were invested in maintaining the old stories. Sarah found her calling working with teenagers who were having spontaneous awakenings, who were seeing auras and hearing thoughts and remembering past lives, and terrified they were going crazy, and she created safe spaces where young people could explore their emerging capacities without judgment, could learn to work with their gifts rather than suppressing them, could understand they were part of a new generation arriving with capabilities that would be normal in the emerging world, but that were threatening to those still operating from the old consciousness. Matthew became a kind of bridge himself, his natural openness and lack of conditioning making him able to communicate with the beings more clearly than most adults, and Daniel would find his youngest son sitting in the fields, surrounded by light, having conversations in frequencies beyond words, returning with information and insights that guided the community's next steps, that helped them navigate the rapidly changing landscape with grace and wisdom beyond his years. Claire's artwork became sought after, her paintings of the beings and the dimensions they revealed selling for amounts that shocked them both, and she used the money to fund the community center they built on the farm, a place where people could come for healing and teaching and simply being held in a field of high consciousness while they integrated their own transformation, and the center attracted teachers and healers from around the world, became a node in the global network of awakening, became known as a place where miracles were common, where the veil between dimensions was thin, where people could experience directly what Daniel's family had been experiencing since that first night when the being appeared during evening prayers. 2 years after the ships appeared, Daniel stood in the same living room where it had all begun, stood with his family and a circle of others who had become like family, and they held hands and spoke the Lord's Prayer together. But now every word was alive with meaning. Every phrase resonated in their bodies and their consciousness. Every syllable was a key that unlocked doors, and as they prayed, the being appeared again, brighter and more defined than ever, and communicated that the first phase of transformation was complete, that humanity had passed through the crisis without destroying itself, that the awakened ones had done their job of holding steady and serving as anchors, that the real work was just beginning, the work of building a civilization based on unity consciousness, the work of healing the planet and restoring balance, the work of taking humanity's place in the galactic community as contributing members rather than isolated children, and Daniel felt such gratitude flooding through him that he could barely stand. Gratitude for the emptiness that had driven him to seek, gratitude for the family that had walked this journey with him, gratitude for the being that had responded to their prayers and changed everything, gratitude for the transformation that was reshaping human civilization in real time, and he understood that this was what prayer had always been for. Not petition to an external God, but alignment with the consciousness that pervaded all things. Not asking for intervention, but participating in co-creation. Not seeking escape from the world, but bringing heaven to earth through how you lived, through the quality of presence you embodied, through the love you expressed in every interaction. And he knew that the kingdom Jesus spoke of was finally manifesting, that the promise was being fulfilled, that humanity was remembering what it had forgotten, that the prodigal species was coming home, and home was not a place, but a recognition, not a destination, but a frequency, not something to achieve, but something to accept. The simple truth that had always been true, but that fear had obscured, that separation was illusion, that love was the only reality, that consciousness was eternal and divine, and everyone was made of it. Everyone was it, everyone was the infinite temporarily pretending to be finite, so the infinite could experience itself from infinite perspectives, and the game was ending or beginning, depending on how you looked at it. The forgetting was giving way to remembering. The darkness was revealing itself to have been light in disguise, teaching through contrast, evolving through challenge, and everything that had seemed like suffering was revealed as necessary, as the friction that polished consciousness until it could recognize its own reflection. And Daniel wept with joy and released the last residue of the person he had been, the farmer who thought he was just a farmer, the man who thought he was just a man, and accepted fully what he had always been beneath the costume of personality, accepted that he was awareness itself, wearing Daniel's life like clothes, accepted that everyone was the same awareness wearing different clothes, accepted that the whole universe was God playing hide-and-seek with itself, and the seeking was ending, the hiding was ending, the game was completing its cycle, and what came next would be beyond anything he could imagine, but he trusted it completely, trusted the intelligence that had orchestrated this impossible journey from matter to consciousness, from separation to unity, from fear to love, trusted that the same benevolence that had guided him this far would guide what came next. And in that trust was perfect peace, was heaven on earth, was the kingdom within finally recognized and lived and celebrated.